we'll get going. This is oral history interview in conjunction with Ranks and the Limerick City Archive with Jack Sciasia.
I'll give you the correct, my pronunciation, Sasha.
Sasha. Very good. I wondered when I spoke to you on the phone yesterday, after I hung up.
It was pretty close.
I hope I was somewhere
pretty close.
accurate.
I get many crazy pronunciations. I have done through the years, especially when I worked in Ranks and I was talking to many of the people in the farming community. I got all sorts of crazy pronunciations.
I can imagine. Very good. Yeah. It's true with the varying accents and regions. Yeah. I suppose, Jack, to get started, just to tell us about how you came to work in Ranks in the beginning.
I did my leaving cert in June 55. There were a few jobs around. Somebody told my family about an office boy's job in Ranks head office, which at that time was in Henry Street, where Bordnagon office was until recently. That's where Ranks head office was. They had another office in the mill attached to the flour and the animal food mill. So everybody who got a job in Ranks head office had to start off as the office boy.
Very good. That was how it went.
That's how it went. So I did you do up to about a year. I think I did 8 or 9 months. And then I was placed in the grain department, where I stayed for the rest of my days until May 1983, when Ranks pulled out of Ireland.
Wow, yeah, that's a fine record.
Very fascinating job.
Absolutely, yeah, I can imagine.
I had a whole range of responsibilities which really I wouldn't have got in any other job. Very interesting. So that's how I started in September 55, and that's how I got into Ranks.
Oh, very good.
As I said, there were very few jobs in Limerick at that stage. Many of the boys, and probably the girls, but the boys generally, many of them had left school after their inter.
Okay.
Girls, some of them did their inter, some of them didn't do, and some of them went on to their leaving, but very, very few, minimal numbers went to university.
The full into the third level, yeah.
Very unlikely.
Then I suppose there's a difference as well. The number of availability.
Little availability, and I would say little money. It would be really only quite wealthy people, because there was no question of grants or whatever in those times.
Of course, yeah.
You know,
different days back then.
So that started off, so I spent until I think it was the following March or April on the post desk, running around or cycling around, and then I went into the grain department and stayed there.
Yeah, which is where
I had two short visits elsewhere. We had a mill in Clara in Offaly, and I worked there for a little while in 57, and we bought a mill in Dublin, the Dublin North City Milling Company in Phibsborough, and I went there for a short while, but it was really only just to sort out specific problems and then came back again,
Very good, yeah. So it was in the mill, in the grain, where it became interesting.
I actually worked in the grain department, which looked after the buying and selling of grain, which was a major item at that stage. Some of the grain was licensed because you were just after the war, and the government had a department. They set up a unit called Grain Importers, and they were the responsible body for bringing grain into Ireland to be allocated then amongst the various mills. Because in 1955 you were still only 10 years after the war.
Absolutely, yeah, only very recent.
And Irish agriculture had been pitiful up to that, and it was only becoming organised. That then eventually disappeared, Grain Importers, and it became the job of the individual mills to buy and sell their own.
Okay, very good. So further responsibility for.
So Ranks had a huge business. They had a third of the flour business in Ireland. Odlum's had slightly more mills. So Odlums had slightly more than 1/3 of the manufacturing capacity. Ranks had slightly less than 1/3. And there was a group of individual flour mills, small family-owned mills, and they had the remaining third as a group. And if the EEC were there today, it was a cartel like you never saw cartels. Because if Ranks sold less this year, then their percentage, they would, the others would have to give back some of their sales to let Ranks' figure go up, or in the matter of buying wheat. If Odlums didn't buy their full percentage of wheat, Ranks would, or the other small mills would sell them some of their wheat. Strictly cartel.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know?
Very good, yeah.
But that didn't worry us in those days, because people didn't even know what a cartel was in 1955. You know,
they were emerging.
I mean, it really didn't become more. How can I put it? It wasn't until Ireland started thinking about going into the EEC. You know, I mean, this was, you're talking 70s, whereas 1956 was the first discussions in Europe, or the first temporary little arrangements about getting together in Euratom and Schumann and all the rest of those. You know.
Wow. And could you see that, Jack, reflected inside the factory itself through the management?
From 1955 until Ireland were almost ready to go into the EEC, Ranks bought grain from all over the country, right across south over to Wexford, the Midlands, up into Galway, and then they bought this flour mill in Dublin, and that gave them further contacts into north of Dublin, you know, Meath, Louth, Cavan. And at that stage I was responsible for buying all that for my sins, because I was in charge of the grain department and I had only one boss, and he was a main board director, but at that stage he was based in Cork, so that was grand.
Yeah.
As long as I made no serious mistakes, my job was okay.
Very good, yeah.
Which was nice, very interesting. You were talking to farmers one minute, you were talking to major co-op managers the next. My job included all the shipping, all the road transport for bulk and bagged grain, because in 1955 up to, for many years, the grain that came into the flour mills came in bags. Now, as you can imagine, small lorry loads, it was years later before you saw these large artics coming in with bulk loads of flour. Sacks was the day. In fact, there was one man in my department, a lot older than myself, and his job was to keep track of bags coming in under grain and bags going back out to the right person.
Of course, yeah. What a job.
It's funny, because I even remember some local farmers coming in with a few bags on a horse and cart. But you see, that was par for the course in 1956, 57, 58.
For the locality, and the people could all make their contribution.
5 to 10 miles out, that was part of their income, maybe the major part of their income. They might just, because their farming was diversified, little bit of milking, little bit of tillage, some vegetables, maybe potatoes or something like that. So the tillage was quite a small element, but an important element, because as soon as they brought their grain in, be it September, October, even up to November, because harvests in those days tended to be later, because you had no massive amounts of equipment. Weather dictated when you had the harvest. As soon as they brought it in, our job was to get a check out to them within about 2 or 3 days.
Very good.
In fact, it was amusing. I often reflected on it in the 70s and 80s as things became more mechanised and more computerised. By the late 70s and 80s, it was taking, we'll say, a week or more to get a cheque out to a co-op. In the late 50s and 60s, the cheque went out the next day.
Done and dusted. Yeah.
And all those things that had to be calculated, and we used to work very long hours in our department. You know, it was all overtime from the end of July, when the barley would start coming in, or early August, right up to early November, when the last of the spring wheat would be harvested, sometimes in deplorable weather conditions.
Yeah, that was it then as well.
I remember, even though I went in 1955 into ranks, some of the lads that were there in 1947, they were gathered together in groups from places like ranks and went out the country to help farmers harvest the harvest. In 1947, the weather was so bad.
I see. Yeah, that's something that you won't see today.
No. You won't see
in any shape.
It wouldn't. It simply couldn't happen. But the lads in Rank's office in Henry Street would be collected in the morning in a truck or whatever and brought out somewhere where they would help with the harvest. Brilliant. It couldn't possibly happen today.
No way. Health and safety and everything, all the regulations.
You would be, yes, all sorts of regulations, you know.
So it was very much a greater, I suppose, concern for the individual and anybody.
It was a huge employer, as were all the flour mills around the country, and that was very important after the Second World War, where industry was minimal, income. They probably paid better wages than many of the industrial units around the country. Probably did. And then there was, for the mill workers, during the harvest time, as I say, from late July into November, and maybe after November, because the grain would be damp generally coming in, and it has to be dry before you can use it in a flour mill. So the drying would go on for quite a while. So there was huge money to be earned in overtime.
Very good.
Right through 7-day a week, 24 hours a day.
Wow.
It is only after that then that after Christmas that things would settle back into a more leisurely. The only round the clock or shift working would be actually in the flour mill itself making flour.
Okay.
Or in the Provender mill making animal foods. Blue Cross Animal Foods was their brand name in the UK. Ranks came here in the early 30s. It's funny, I was talking to an executive later on, and the question arose like, when did Ranks decide to pull out? Because they actually closed here in 1983. And he remarked that when they made the decision to pull out when they were setting up in the early 30s. Because what they did in 1983 is they closed the last of the flour mills in Limerick and Dublin. All the others had been closed. In earlier years they had bought flour mills in Cork, Middleton, Mallow, Clonakilty. Ranks had one in Clara and the one in Dublin. But the last two were in Dublin and Limerick, and Limerick was vastly bigger than Dublin. What they did was, when they closed those two, they simply supplied all their customers by sending in flour in bulk from 2 flour mills in the UK, in Barry and in Birkenhead. So no extra cost. The only cost was an actual transport cost, but the savings were massive.
Of course, everything had been established.
Signs on. See, Ranks was owned by an English company called Rank Hovis McDougall, and RHM were shortly after they closed in Ireland. They were taken over by another company because it was clear, like, it was quite profitable.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But I would have to say that the years I worked there, it was a fascinating and interesting job.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say animal feeds. And
Yes, animal feeds. Yeah.
What other kind of produce would have come out of ranks?
The mills like Ranks made flour, a wide variety of flour: baker's flour, retail flour, large sacks, small packs, all those sort of things. But essentially, they made flour, wholemeal, bakers, and various types of flour. They also made, because they were in the grain business, they made animal foods, and they would use a number of imported grains: maize, milo, which is sorghum, and then there were a lot of items like fish meal, soya. They were all additives into the animal food. So in general, the mills made, there were two sides to them: flour and provender for animals.
Oh, very good. Yeah, absolutely. And would you say have seen some of the local farmers that would have contributed their grain? Would they have?
Actually, I mean, some of them would actually come into Ranks, and we'd negotiate prices. And really, it was no negotiation, because what you did was you took a sample, you gave it into the laboratory tested it, produced a set of results, and the agreed rates, which were agreed at the start of every season, for all the mills, they would get the agreed rate, depending on the quality. But they all like to have a chat. So very early on, I got to chat to loads of farmers.
Brilliant.
In fact, some months ago, I was out in Abington. Abington is a Church of Ireland church, a little bit outside Limerick. And its first rector in 1660 was John Cripps. And I got to hear about that they were looking for any information about John Cripps. So I brought out all the information and I gave it to them. But there was 3 or 4 people there one day, and one chap living quite near Abington, his father and mother used to send in their grain on tractors, probably at that stage, into Ranks back in the 50s.
Wow.
You'll still run into them. I mean, you say you're from Nina. There was at least 2 major agents for Ranks in Nina: Jimmy O'Hara and North Tipperary Maltings, run by a man named Brown.
That's amazing. Yeah, O'Hara's is still
there.
Still there. Yeah.
Is Jimmy still there, or is he dead and gone? His sons were running. He had a son running it in later years. Because Jimmy now would be a good bit older than myself.
Yeah, and I think you could be right. God forbid, I'd never like to speculate, but I do recall my mother telling me how Jimmy organised a job for one of her sisters in the mill, in the office in the mill herself. So yeah,
it all ties
in. Absolutely, very good.
Yeah.
So and they were.
In actual fact, when I started in Ranks, it was Jimmy's father, old James, who used to come in and chat to my boss at the time, back in 56, 57.
Well, fantastic. Through the negotiations and.
Well, it would be they'd call in, because flour mills paid agents like Jimmy O'Hara and the North Tipperary Maltings a commission. So Jimmy would bring in, he would buy your wheat off you at the agreed price, and for every lot he got commission, and he got a rate for delivering it, a carriage fee. And if he dried it, he got paid for drying it.
Okay, very good.
You know, so it was a nice little earner for Ranks agents around the country. I still actually have a list of the agents somewhere at home. I'm still kicking myself. A couple of years ago, I had a notebook, and I used to do budgets each year for my department, and I'd make out how much this grain we would use and how much that grain we'd use and how much the other grain, and then cost it. And I actually must have torn out the pages to use a blank page and they disappeared. They probably went into the waste paper bin, but they had actually the detail of what went into all the products.
Wow.
I'm kicking myself for that I still didn't make sure I kept it. You know.
Yeah. You never know.
The shipping part of it was very interesting. I was particularly interested because in 1859, my great-grandfather, on a vessel called the Bratty Pelisic, brought grain from the Black Sea, from Odessa to Limerick. He was the captain. Met my great-grandmother here and promptly stayed. Got married and stayed. And the Bratty was actually sold out of Limerick in 1860.
Fascinating.
That's why 100 years later I ended up buying grain. Before we went into the EEC, we used to buy the flour mills generally around the country. We would buy Canadian wheat, American wheat, Australian wheat, and wheat and maize from the Black Sea, Romanian particularly. And that would be shipped out of ports like Constanza in the Black Sea. And I ended up buying that. And 100 years earlier, my great-grandfather had actually brought it to Limerick, because in the mid-1800s, there were numerous small flour mills in Limerick. You'll probably see them in the records, in the archives here. Many small flour mills.
That's right.
Bannatynes, Russells, you name it. And some of those mills, the actual mills existed certainly into the 60s and 70s. There was a major flour mill at Newtown Perry, where the Henry Street Garda Barracks is. There was another flour mill in Rocher Street, in the middle of the city. And those stone buildings, if you look in Rocher Street, the stone buildings are actually, the remnants of them are still there.
Yeah, fantastic to still have them.
But so that's why I say I was particularly interested in the shipping side. And there's one thing that galls me. When Ranks closed, they literally closed the door and we went and signed on. There was one book in my department, big, thick, old book, and an earlier edition of it, which had a complete record of all the vessels that came into Limerick, where they came from, what they carried, because in the 50s and 60s and 70s, I actually entered up that book. And that was left there, so I think some of those books went to maybe to the National Archives, maybe even the City Archives.
Yeah.
But I never actually thought to look back to 1859 and see where my great-grandfather's vessel came into Limerick with the cargo. But I actually have a newspaper cutting, you see, that the Bratty Pelisic came to Limerick in, I think it was March 1859, with a cargo of grain from Odessa.
Fantastic, yeah. And maybe possibly could still be an opportunity to have a look at them.
There might be,
today.
if it's around. Because these books, in those days, Rank's office was like a Victorian office, one from Dickens' time even. Big high desks, large, heavy-bound books. And by the way, the office boy had to bring all those books down to the safe in the basement every single night and back up next morning.
That's fine.
You earned your crust.
Absolutely, every bit of it.
Earned your crust. Then during the harvest, I would look after hiring carriers to bring grain into Limerick or into Dublin or into Clara, where there was a flour mill, or into Cork or Clonakilty or Mallow or Middleton. But gradually all those outside small mills closed down first.
Amazing, yeah. So you were, in a sense, operating on a national level from Ranks and international, of course.
In actual fact, all the mills, except for the small family-owned mills who bought grain just around themselves, around their own local area, the other two groups, the Odlum group and the Rank group, bought grain even in competition from all around the country. Ranks might have an agent in Neenah, and Odlums might have an agent in Neenah. And those agents would go out and chat to local farmers who they would maybe cherry pick who had the best grain or the best land on which to have tillage.
Very good. Would those agents, Jack, as well act as sales people for ranks and their products?
Very often they would. Very often they would be selling not so much flour, but certainly the animal foods.
Yeah.
Flour would be sold mainly to, on the one hand, to bakeries. That was a specific type of flour. Then the other type of flour would be sold direct to shops because there were no supermarkets. Or they might be sold to small groups, like there might be somebody in West Clare, which there was, who would take a large stock of retail flour, that would be flour bought by the housewives, and then he would supply it into small local country shops, you know.
Very good. Yeah.
But in the main, the grain agents, they would have a lot of contacts, and in particular they would probably be an outlet for the animal foods that were produced by all the mills.
Yeah.
And in fact there were mills which didn't produce flour at all, only animal food.
I see. And Jack, as many of the industries then as well would have been very family orientated. Were you the only Sciasia?
No, I wasn't the only Sciasia. My father's first cousin was already working there, and he had worked all his life there. His son worked there. His sister worked there. And then on the other side, I had a granduncle who also worked in what was called the dock store, which was on the quayside in the docks. In general, it would be unlikely that you'd get in to any of those firms, Ranks, Clothing Factory, Shaw's, Matterson's, any of those, unless you had a family member there. They were your in.
That was your connection. Yeah.
Rarely did you see people without a connection getting in. There were some, of course, but rarely.
Yeah, very good. I suppose it was in a sense a way for the employers to have
it was an ideal way.
Yeah, for recruitment, but
because if you were a problem, they might speak to your father or your uncle or whatever, you know. And sometimes there were quite large families. I'm talking now, you might have 5 or 6 people from one family working, and not just in Ranks, but in the industries generally, locally in Limerick.
Mm-hmm. So
but that applied right throughout Ireland.
Absolutely, yeah.
Everywhere.
At the time.
And in every industry.
Par for the course, and that's how it went. So I suppose when hard times for industries like that would have come, it would have affected greatly
costs
majorly on
completely wiped out all those major industries. Like I said, Ranks had taken a view many years earlier that they were going to close their operation in Ireland, and all they had to do was put on an extra shift or something in Barry or in Birkenhead and ship it over in these large bulk tankers and supply the bakeries in that way. And probably bring in Arctics, bring in the small packs for the various the Tesco's and those that were there in those days.
Yeah.
You know, but it wiped out all major industry. Limerick was highly industrialised. Even when I was going to work in 1955, the dock road would be chock-a-block with bikes, very few cars, because you had McMahon's and Spates and the wire factory and the cement factory, and everybody went to work on a bike, if they had a bike.
Yeah. Way to go. Would be a great thing to see coming back.
Mm-hmm.
A great thing to see coming back, maybe. A greater use of bicycles.
It was unbelievable, the throngs of bikes. It's like, I mean, in recent years, Tiananmen Square, you see photographs of some years ago, thronged with bikes. Now, of course, it's thronged with Mercs and Rolls Royces and BMWs. But the dock road would be like that in the morning and at lunchtime.
A fascinating scene.
And at night, yeah.
Absolutely. And was there a social element to
huge social
to
element?
the factory?
Huge social element, because almost every one of those, well, in ranks, we'll just speak about ranks, they actually had a social club. They had a social club in the mill, and they had a social club in the office, which was, as I say, a mile away. And the social club at the mill was very well organised financially, and they'd have teams for soccer matches and sports days. Probably a bit ahead of their time, because in later years that became quite a popular thing.
Absolutely,
with the multinationals, you know.
Yeah, so you were, as a ranks employee, you were probably considered very, very lucky at the time to have that.
I can remember being told, when I say where you're working, I'm working in ranks, that's better than the bank, and it actually was better than the bank in those days. You paid better.
Very good, yeah. It's amazing to see, because you don't have so much of that.
You've nothing like that now.
Nothing like it, really.
No. I mean, the only comparable one is Dell, where you had a large proportion of a local population working in one place. A generation before that, you had Ferenca, and you won't remember Ferenca, but it was like that. You know. There was a lot to be said for it, and a lot to be said against it, because there were totally economic work practices. The numbers simply created such high overheads. They couldn't exist in competition with similar products coming into the country or whatever. You know?
I understand. Yeah.
In a way, that's what happened in England on a much wider scale with industry. Suddenly England wasn't able to produce what could be brought in. And we've seen that progress over the last 30 years to China, Taiwan, India, you name it. How are you going?
Oh, we're good, yeah. First for myself, Jack, so it's always good to be to be
Have you any other questions that maybe had occurred to you? You know, because you see, I can talk till the cows come home, but part of it will be misdirected. It will be to satisfy my own ego, whereas you have a specific list of queries to cover certain areas.
Too specific, You've very much systematically come down through them, Jack, brilliantly. I have to say, where I am here is just to ask you about the fire in 1978.
The fire in 1978 was in the Garryowen shed, and I personally conducted the negotiations with the insurance company to get paid for that grain.
Wow.
Because I did the insurance each month, I would have to put down what grain was where throughout the mill. And because the Garryowen shed was a very old store, it held only grain. So it ended up with I discussing the values of what was there.
Of course, and who better to discuss it than...
Well, it was my job.
Yeah,
I had to have notes of what stock was where and keep track of the stock and the stock that was in the Garryowen shed. It was... Are you familiar with the silo that's still there?
Yeah.
A little bit beyond that is an old cut stone building called the Dock Store. That old cut stone building has bins in it. They're in oak frames, timber bins where the grain will be pulled in. In the silo that's there are vertical bins, each of them probably a little bigger than the area of the table, like a honeycomb, down through it.
Oh, wow.
And the grain would be stored in each of those. And the Garryowen shed was between that number one silo and the Dock Store.
Okay.
And out on the quayside was a system of underground conveyors. A vessel would come into the dock, discharge its grain into the underground conveyor and be brought into number one silo or down to the Dock Store, or into the Garryowen shed, or across the road, underground conveyors to the other 3 silos in the mill.
My God, yeah, that's amazing.
A marvellous operation.
Absolutely, yeah.
Marvellous operation. But that fire, I would say Ranks probably profited out of that fire because the grain was paid for. It's only a matter of buying more grain. But the building itself was destroyed. So I would think myself that probably the money for the building was probably never spent. On the other hand, in that number 1 silo, which is still there, with Bannatyne's name, who was one of the original mills up on the side of it, Ranks put in what's called a load cell scale. It was when a vessel came in, and the system of load cell is that it discharges the grain into this weighing machine. When there's a specific amount entered into this compartment, it tips, and each time it tipped. And Rank spent, I think the figure was £250,000 was the cost of installing that, brand new, into number 1 silo. And then they closed.
Wow.
It was never used once. And a similar thing had happened years earlier in Mallow. Ranks built a new mill in a place called Quarterstown in Mallow. And when it was finished, they closed the operation in Mallow before it ever worked.
Amazing, really, isn't it? Yeah. And would that have been because of maybe developments in Britain?
They were at that stage. You see, they were centralising production, and even though they'd spent all the money in Quarterstown, it wasn't worth working it.
And
the production would move to Cork or some to Limerick or whatever. But that load cell ware, to this day, it still galls me the fact that it was installed. Because that was only in the 80s, you know. I mean, it closed in 83, but was never used to discharge a ship. And that was a big sum of money in the early 80s, $250,000.
Yeah, huge money too.
But they probably saved a hell of a lot more by closing all the place. Just a matter of economics. I mean, in the States they've been doing that for years. When some place becomes uneconomic, they simply close it or sell it or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
But that's the story of the Garryowen shed. It was a long, low building. I would think 20 feet high between that number 1 silo and the dock store. In fact, you can probably see where the roof of it joined the dock store still.
That's right,
but they never rebuilt it.
No, it was never rebuilt after.
No, the land was owned by the harbour authorities. And years earlier, Ranks had got permission to build their stores on it, because the harbour commissioners had dockers. There was something like 340 or 350 dockers employed by the harbour commissioners. But when Ranks would bring in a ship, Ranks had their own dockers. Huge saving, because all that would happen is that these men would be taken off their otherwise different duties and moved over onto the quayside on the 2 or 3 days that the vessel would be discharging. So when the dock store burned down, there would have been all sorts of negotiations have had to take place before they could decide what could be rebuilt again on Harbour Commissioner, Harbour Office, the Harbour Commissioner's ground.
Very good,
you know?
yeah.
And anyway, they probably didn't want to spend the money. It was gone into stock, you know, to cut down the overdraft.
Mm. And would the grain that was lost in the fire, would that have interrupted or stalled?
No, it didn't interrupt them, because we held huge stocks.
Okay.
And anyway, I would ring London and say I want to buy, 1,000 tons of French wheat or 1,500 tons of maize or whatever, and I want it for shipment in 7 or 14 days. And you'd get it like that. You might pay a little bit more for it. but to be replaced very quickly.
Yeah,
the biggest
was
delay
there.
would be in actually getting a ship in position to load at some port. We'll say in France, if you were buying French wheat and was free to come to Limerick. But no, there was actually no delay in production.
Very good. Yeah, yeah. Fantastically efficient.
But you see, Ranks had huge storage. They had 4 silos, dock store, Garryowen shed. There was a store actually uptown where, I'm trying to think what's there now. There's a new multi-storey building just facing the new bridge at the side of Henry Street, Garda Barracks, we'll call it. Very high building, higher than the Clarion.
Yeah.
And there was a store not too far from there, an old stone store called Sutton's store. Sutton's had a coal yard there. But Ranks had this tall stone building, and they used to store grain there as well.
Oh, okay, very good. And that building is still there?
No,
it's
the
not.
old stone building is not.
Okay, yeah.
But that's low. I think we've probably covered the Garryowen shed fire.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I vividly remember, because it was a simple job. You just went back to what stocks you had there yesterday and calculated them and talked to the loss adjuster from the insurance company and said, well, we had this, and this, and this is what it cost us to replace it. I've been onto the markets this morning, and the maize will cost so much, the milo will cost so much, the Australian wheat or French wheat or whatever, or the Irish wheat, and they just paid up.
Yeah, yeah. I guess was it the dry nature of the stores and that made them susceptible to
possibly it was, but
fire and
the building was so old. I never actually heard what was the cause of the fire.
Yeah.
But one element that we used to have to be very careful of, whatever about wheat and barley, maize is highly combustible and inflammable, and it could go up in a flash. When we would dip the bins, you'd have like in number 1 silo, you would drop a tape measure into it, see what space was left, and you had the dimensions of the bin so you could calculate how much wheat was in it. But you had to be very cautious in case you wouldn't create a spark in bins that had maize in them, because the maize dust is highly inflammable or could go up in a flash.
Wow.
Quite dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there ever anybody?
Yes, there was a man actually killed in the, I'd say it was the early 70s or late 60s, in the dock store, in the Garryowen shed. I think it was the Garryowen shed, not the dock store. They were loading grain into a bin, and he slipped and was sucked in, and it's like drowning. You can't swim against it because the flow of material is up. But there was a poor chap died in one of the bins. There wasn't another fatality that I remember was in the warehouse, which was, I think, was a 7 or 8 floor warehouse, and there were lifts for bringing packets or pallets up and down, but there were skids, a spiral run on which they would load bags, and there was a strict warning, you don't ever go on a skid. There was a good reason for that. This chap decided to take a shortcut down the skid. A bag coming from behind just simply hit him in the back of the head, broke his neck.
Yeah.
Another man, the lift was, as far as we were concerned, they were reliable, but he forced the door and got caught. I think he went underneath it and moved down and crushed him. But they're industrial accidents that don't happen anymore because health and safety is ultra careful, and rightly so.
Absolutely, yeah, and rightly so, exactly, yeah. And was there maybe for your own job, Jack? Were you at any times you were particularly challenged? Challenged
every year because. From the time I got married in January 1968. Well, come July, I wouldn't get home until all hours at night. I'd be working very long hours, July, August, September and into October. But then the lads in the mill were working as well, because just the grain department in the office would be working. In 1960 they closed the head office in Henry Street and they built a new office in the mill. Up at the back there was a lot of space there. And so you just worked until the job was done at night.
That was it, yeah.
That was it, yeah. And lucky to have a job.
Absolutely.
Because, don't forget, in 1955 and in the 60s, and then again in the 70s, and again in the 80s, there were all very severe recessions going on for a couple of years in each of those decades. You know, this isn't the first time we've had a recession.
No.
And some of them, I think, were even more severe than the present one. Not in the level of debt, because the level of debt is so big that nothing like it has been seen before. But in terms of human economics, huge numbers of unemployed. I would think that probably most of the lads that were in my class up to the leaving had to move out of Limerick. I still have there'll be at least one of them at that meeting that Jackie was talking about. I went to school at the Model, and this lad and myself, we started the same day. But there are a few of those around, because in '55 there was very few jobs around.
And when they closed, then when Ranks shut down
closed,
in 1983, how do you think
it was a disaster? Because I had worked. I just came out of school and went to work. And in '83, I just started signing on. Went to Foss. I worked for a short time for a company that was exporting fish. And 4 years later, in '87, I'll go back a bit. In 1962, I helped start a credit union. And in '87, there was a vacancy, and I got a full-time job there.
Very good.
So in that job, I used to look after investments and literally do any job that was necessary.
Right,
I'd make the tea if it needed me. You know.
Yeah.
And I had been a volunteer worker from 1962 up to '87, you see. And when I retired, and I decided to retire in 2002. A month before I was due to retire, my wife was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She died shortly afterwards. But I had decided anyway I was retiring from work. So I went back to being voluntary, and I still do voluntary work there.
Okay, Jack. Yeah, okay. I imagine.
I have loads of interest. That's why I don't have endless time. I mean, this is interesting, but I wouldn't have time to be talking to you every day.
Of course,
I've loads of things that I do. You know.
Absolutely, yeah, it's great.
But so that's what I do now. I actually do volunteer work for a credit union, but I do loads of other things. But that's like. It's a work environment, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do look after lending, and I look after investments and general things like that.
Very good. And the other employees that would have when the factory closed?
Not many got jobs.
No.
I would think that if you take the mill workers, 100% of the mill workers, I couldn't say exactly, but I would say more than 50% didn't get work afterwards because they were too old. In '83, I was 46. I must have sent out 1,000 CVs, no jobs.
Right, yeah.
A cousin came to me one day. She was working for this fish company and said, would I come in and do a specific job? And I did it for 15 months, and that was grand. But there weren't a lot of jobs around in '83, or '84, or '85, or '86.
So it was quite a blow to the city.
And very few of the office staff. Some of them did get jobs, but again, the older people didn't. Well, older than 46.
Yeah.
Things were very difficult in the mid-'80s.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the difficulty between then and now is that the people who were out of work were generally married and had families. So it became very difficult.
Yeah. So how to support the family then was the question.
It was an enormous economic blow for Limerick when Ranks closed. But then it was no different when the clothing factory closed, or Ferenca closed, or Matterson's, or Shaw's, or any of the baking companies.
Mm.
But that's what happens in life, not just in Limerick. It happens in life. I mean, it's like the motor industry in the States. I mean, Detroit is only a shell now, whereas it was biggest manufacturing unit in the world.
Yeah.
That's switched now to the back of beyond in China.
Yeah, so far removed.
Anything else there now?
No, that's where we're done. We're definitely done on what's on the sheet. But I suppose it's a good reflection, Jack. Would you say on kind of that ability of Limerick people, as you say, across the world, as for people in general to recover?
Well, if you specifically relate to the people working in Ranks, I think you'll find that if you talk to any of them, I doubt if any of them would be really annoyed or upset, or they would have mostly would have said, "Yeah, great place to work and great friends there."
Yeah.
You know, and that came out the night of the meeting here in the civic offices. There were board members there. There was a couple of people who were brought in to close the place, and they came down from Dublin. And every one of them was chatted like they were all pals. People forgot like that they were the ones that drew the line under and said, "Yeah, it's uneconomic, close it." Everybody got on well that night. I didn't see any person that wasn't delighted to see every other person there. And that will apply probably on Friday, whatever meeting. On Friday, I don't know who's coming, but it'll probably be all local people anyway.
Very good, yeah. Well, great, and hopefully that same feeling and that great atmosphere will
it'll die out because as people get older and you know.
Of course, yeah.
That's it, you know. But for as things are now, lovely memories.
Great. Jack, I think we'll leave it there.
Okay.
That was very good.
Good.